I sometimes ask myself, was the Center for Cultural Studies like the Frankfurt School? You know, the Birmingham School, the Frankfurt School. And I wonder whether there was a moment, like there often was in Birmingham, when Horkheimer said to Adorno, well, shall we read some Nietzsche? Shall I read Heidegger? You know, I mean, we were constantly saying, what should we read next? Richard Hoggart, you know, used to give out copies of poems for Central Cultural Studies people to culturally read. I mean, you know, what did that mean? What did it mean to culturally read the opening of D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers? Or George Orwell's Shooting an Elephant? Or indeed Sylvia Plath's Daddy? Students didn't know. I didn't know. Richard Hoggart wasn't sure. So he said, well, let's read some other things which might put these things in context. You know, I can't describe to you how primitive a level this operation is developing at. So when I hear, you know, the Birmingham School, you know, we occupied the most marginal places in the Birmingham campus. We were lodged underneath the clock tower. Nobody even knew there was a room underneath the clock tower. Then we moved to the edge of the campus where we overlooked the playing fields. Nobody knew there were any students out there either. So we moved from one marginal position to another. This is not the unfolding of some preordained intellectual project. This is, you know, this is the construction of an intellectual project. Now, what is the construction about? The construction is about the overwhelming sense that we were in a new moment, in a new conjuncture, and that new conjuncture required serious intellectual work, serious research, serious thinking about, sustained, independent, original, innovative thinking, and that this would disturb and shake the traditional shape of knowledge, the existing disciplinary framework, the boundaries, the boundary between what it is possible to say within an intellectual discourse and what is happening outside. It is a response to a moment. Now, the reason why I emphasize that, it's a response to lots of other things, but what I think now is the importance of this constitutive response to a particular historical moment, the opening of the 1960s. And what was significant about that was the introduction of Gramsci, and as Marina rightly says, it is Lydia who reminded us that Gramsci had something to say both about the centrality of what we have come to call the cultural and about the complexity of the relationship between the cultural and everything else. Gramsci was at that moment virtually unknown in Britain, virtually unknown. Extracts of Machiavelli and the Prince had appeared from a Lawrence and Wishart volume in the 50s, and later Gwyn Williams, who's a Welsh historian, wrote 2 volumes on the workers' movement in Turin and Gramsci, and then of course the selection from the prison notebooks and so on. But at that moment, at the moment when the center was searching around for models which might help to guide and shape its intellectual practice, Gramsci was virtually unknown. And I remember the moment when Lydia said, "Have you heard of Croce?" "No." "Well, have you heard of Gramsci?" "Sort of." And we began to think about what Gramsci had to offer. I want to say about that now that thinking back, quite apart from the importance of that Gramscian moment for my own work, which I don't want to speak about here, it's been completely formative for me. It's a very bizarre experience because, of course, I can't read Gramsci in the original. So I only make up Gramsci, as they say. That's what Gramsci scholars are nice enough to say about me. "You make up a nice Gramsci," they say. I'm very loath to come to Gramsci conferences because I think they'll smoke me out. You know, they'll find out that I really don't. But that's a different thing. I know Gramsci in translation, but this is the moment of translation we're talking about. It's the moment when ideas begin to move partly in translation. And the very misreadings, the misreading of a text produced in one culture by those who need that text but in another culture, the very mistranslations, the very gaps and shifts constitute what cultural translation is about. As we know, there is no perfect translation. It is impossible. It's impossible to make transparent one language to another. But what is untransparent about the shift between one language and another is precisely the imprint of culture, the imprint of the movement of ideas, texts, events from one culture to another. So I don't apologize for mistranslating Gramsci or misreading Gramsci. But what is important for cultural studies was the point that I've just made, namely, we were looking for a way of understanding culture as part of a larger social formation, but in a way which neither reduced culture to something else or lifted culture out of everything else and fetishized it. Neither reduction nor fetishization, but the linkage between the cultural and other things, that is to say, the articulation, the question of articulation. Lydia's involvement in, I don't want to go into detail about her involvement in cultural studies because I don't have a lot of time, but on another visit, she was very involved in media studies, in the work of the media studies group, which had formed up since the last time that she was there. The Unity of Current Affairs Television, which we published, was very much a text in whose production the work and research involved in that. This was around questions of media narrative, around the question of how to decode a text politically, how to understand the relationship between text and political context. One of the sets of informal seminars which Lydia and I have constantly held is in our shared interest in popular culture, in popular television and popular narrative, and very much then the involvement of Lydia in the work of the women at the center in feminism and in the volume which was subsequently published as Women Take Issue, and the intervention of feminism in cultural studies, the way in which the slow configuration of a field of work that I've tried to describe was then reconfigured by feminism and reconfigured by race, and a series of interruptions, an interrupted field being itself interrupted is how we can understand how cultural studies develops conceptually in that early period. I can only speak really until the end of until the 70s, the mid-80s.